Started.
We put a pacemaker in.
Yeah.
Well, at least it,
Keep her ticking for them.
well,
All right,
that's,
class, we're gonna go ahead and get started, and it is already November the 6th. It's crazy. Today's lesson is about the widow and her mites. So we're picking up that it's the one hit wonders. I believe it's number 10, if I'm not mistaken. And moving along with that. So the first thing I want to admit to is last week I was talking about how we hate to make mistakes in the videos because they're such a mess to correct. Plus, we hate to have a mistake out there. So who caught the mistake in today's video? Anybody catch one? I didn't catch it. I've seen this video many times, and I didn't catch it till last night. We were driving back from Dallas, and Robin and I listened to it. And once while we were listening, when I heard it, I went, "Oh no, I've got to go fix that." Anybody catch anything? It's one of those, just like I was telling you about it, when you just hear it, it just doesn't strike you. But we've actually had a lesson on this in the past. So when I heard it this time, it was totally out of context. So just in passing, we talked in the video about the widows. And one of the widows we talked about was Dorcas, also named Tabitha. So where's Dorcas from? Joppa, right? Good, because we've talked about why Joppa was important in the past and how related to Caesarea. In the video, we said that she was from the town that Peter was in, where they call Peter from. So we had a mistake on where Dorcas was from. And it just once I heard it, I went, "Oh, yep, I know she's from Joppa." So Lydda. And so they sent for Peter. He was nearby, and that's where he came from to get her or to heal her. So now we have a mistake that I'll spend this afternoon with my folks trying to figure out how we'll fix. The other thing I want to pass this around. We are talking about the widow with her 2 mites. So I'm going to pass around a mite so that you can have a feel. This is in a jewelry setting. So this is a necklace that Robin has. So you can pass it around and just imagine how all the money you have are 2 of those, and they're basically together worth less than a penny of what we would have today. So that'll give you an idea of that. The other thing I want to put in place are some things in context before we start the lesson. One of them is Mitch and I never talk about his sermon in my lesson, but sometimes they really come together well. And today it comes together in a slightly different way, maybe than normal. Our lesson today takes place just before most of what Mitch was talking about. The story of the widow's mites happens just before the Passover dinner. That you're in time, you're hours or maybe a day or 2 away. So if you look at it in the parallel Gospels, it was placed right before all of Jesus talking at the very end. So don't think about this story as being at the first of Jesus' ministry or in the middle. This is at the very end. And it must have been really important for Luke to throw this in a very serious part of his lesson. So keep that in context as we go. Let me add Don. So that's one thing in time I want to put. I also want to put this in place. I realized today I have had a mistaken impression. Not that I was wrong, because none I really thought about before, but I realized that one of my impressions was wrong. And actually 2 of them were wrong. So I'm going to bring those up because perhaps you have the same one. I'm going to pass around this map of Jerusalem. And I want you to see this map that I'll pass around so you can hold it out. Is a panoramic view looking at the Temple Mount from the east, from the Mount of Olives. And you're actually looking, you're a little bit southeast. looking back. And the key to it, when you look at this, there's this gold dome right in the middle. And the gold dome is the current rock, Dome of the Rock is the name of it. It's the Muslim temple that's there. It's approximately located where the old temple was that got destroyed. So if you're looking at this, this will give you an idea. The gold dome gives you an idea about where the temple was. Okay. And so this is looking across from the Mount of Olives, across the Kidron Valley and into or on top of the Temple Mount. And one of the things that I want you to see when you're doing this, there's a wall that goes all across here. Just to the north of that, there's a gate in that wall. That's the eastern gate, or the beautiful gate. And now it's all got graves below it, because the Arabs have buried people there, believing that will help keep Jesus out. And so it's kind of a odd thing, but this will give you an idea of about what it would look like from the Mount of Olives to look over into the temple. Now, why I want to set that into position is because part of this story depends on what the temple looks like and how it's set. And this is one of the places where I was wrong. The Temple Mount is a rectangle that goes north to south in length. Okay, it's longer north to south. And I've always in my mind thought, oh, well, then that's how the temple was set up, north to south. But that's wrong. The temple was also a rectangle, but it ran lengthwise east to west. And so the east part right here is approximately pointing towards the gate that you're looking at. So think of this, the temple, as running. This would be set approximately where the Dome of the Rock is. It would be running east to west. Where this is east, just like we do our maps, typically east is to the right. This would be the entrance into the temple, but it had other entrances around it also. Around this edge and maybe further, well, just outside of this is what's called Solomon's Colonnade. You remember that's referenced in the Bible, that's where the disciples met. So you have out here the Solomon's Colonnade. This first rim was the court of the Gentiles. So the Gentiles were allowed to be in there. These would be the God-fearers that we've talked about several times. Gentiles who believed in God, but they had not converted to be Jews. They were allowed to come into this area and worship God. So do you remember a story in the Bible where that matters? Okay, so it's the story when at the very end of Paul's when he is accused of bringing Gentiles into the temple area. He's accused of allowing or bringing with him Gentiles from here into the rest of the temple area. They're allowed to be here. They're just not allowed to go inside. Now inside is this area right here, about a third of this whole area is called the court of the women. Okay, so the women are allowed to go there. How that impacts this story is this is where women were allowed to be, but it's also where a lot of the where you donated money, those jars were in the court of the women. So the story we're talking about today takes place in the court of the women. That's how she could be there. That's how a woman could be in the temple area. It's also where they gave. This inside here is where you have the altars and the bronze laver and all of that stuff sitting here. Then you have the Holy of Holies area in here.
So the men that talked about, they make their contribution in the women's area as well.
That's right. Anybody could make their contribution here.
The God-fearers or Gentiles, could they, before this time, ever become Jews, or were they always an outcast because they were not born into a Jewish family?
Yeah, they were not born and they weren't circumcised.
Right,
Right.
but so they could never be a Jew, but
They could become a Jew.
they,
A God-fearer could become a Jew by converting to Judaism and getting circumcised.
before this time period. though?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's always been, you could
Okay.
become a Jew if you were willing to do that.
It had to be because all their servants and stuff got circumcised.
That's
All
how,
of them weren't Jews.
if they chose to do that, but otherwise they would leave their servants as Gentiles, right? But there's God-fearers all the way through the New Testament. Cornelius was a God-fearer,
Mhm.
for instance. Probably many of the early Christians were God-fearers, and that was the whole thing about in Acts 13 or 15, whichever, when they had the first council of Jerusalem. And they say, okay, you can be a Christian, but you don't have to be circumcised. And God-fearers are going, okay, we're in. They finally got to be part of the important group at that point. So this is important to understand why the woman can be where the men are, where the contributions are given, and so on like that. Okay, so does that kind of make sense? Now, the other thing that kind of, that was my first impression. I always thought that was flipped around, but it's not. So this is coming out the east gate. And Jesus would have been, when he's on the Mount of Olives praying, he would have been here looking this way. Okay. So we also have stories in the Bible where people are upset at the money changers because when they bring their money to get changed, the money changers would charge them a lot of money to do that. But they had to pay the temple tax in shekels, which was the priest controlled that. So if you were going to pay your temple tax, you had to pay it in shekels, not in Greek coins. But this story, if you listen to the video, the woman has Greek coins. So I've been all this time thinking anything that you gave God had to be converted. But no, that's probably not the case. You had to pay certain things like your temple tax in the converted money.
What was the temple tax? Every time you went in?
No, they had like, the men had to every year pay a certain amount. And so that had to be paid in official Jewish money.
Was it all, everybody had been the same, or was it based on?
No, everybody was the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody was the same. And you had other things, if you had to pay an offering or something that had to be paid in the official Jewish money that the priest controlled. So they would rip you off when you're trying to give your thing. But if you're giving offerings here in the court of women, you don't have to pay that in any specific. It could be a piece of gold, it could be anything. It didn't have to be the official money language. That's why the woman could have a coin that is a Greek coin or Roman coin or anything else, as long as it's given here as an offering, not as a temple tax. So I thought, okay, that helped me bring that into a little bit better consistency. That Holy of Holies. Yeah, this is where when Zechariah is doing his incense and he struck down, that's where he would have been inside of this Holy of Holies. This is where the curtain would have been that was torn when Jesus was crucified. And this is a pretty big area. I don't have the dimensions with me, but it was large enough to have this could have had thousands of people in it at one time.
At that point,
I'm sorry, only the men were allowed here. Yeah. And in here, you had to be priests, certain types of priests.
at that point, was the Ark of the Covenant there?
At this time, you had the Ark of the Covenant, but the Ark of the Covenant only had, I believe, the only thing that was left in the Ark of the Covenant was the stone tablets. The Aaron's staff and the jar of manna, I think by this time was gone. So that's the setup we're looking at here. So this widow is allowed to be there. When, for instance, when Jesus and would have come, they would have, think about the whole Temple Mount as being from here, this down. So Jesus and his family would have come up the southern steps here. Anybody who's visiting the temple, almost all of them except for one group, would have come through the southern steps and entered this whole open area before they got into the actual temple area. And this is very large. I don't know what's Dave off the top, 200 yards by 600 yards. Or
Is
I
it
mean,
flat
it's
there? or
big.
walking
It's
uphill?
flat on top. Yeah, you come upstairs on this end. The old mountain would have been, this would have been Mount Moriah where Abraham took Isaac, where David bought the altar. So when David bought the altar, this is where he would have bought it. The altar, the threshing floor of Uriah, I think is how you say it, would have been in this area. And they built the temple on top of it. So this would have, the old city of Jerusalem where David lived would have been down here.
Mhm.
And the pilgrims would have come up here. And there would have been baptismal pools where they could get ritually clean. And then come through the southern steps in this area. And on top, this was the platform. Herod built this. So originally, this was a mountain where it was high on this end, low on this end. Herod took the top half of the mountain and flipped it over to cut it up into pieces and flipped it over and made this a flat platform. But it's an amazing feat of engineering. And the stones, when Jesus talks about the stones, not one left being on the other, for those of you who've been there, those stones are some of them are as big as railroad cars. And Herod somehow, his people had enough capacity to be able to cut them and move them, and they're flat. I mean, you talk about engineering, they are so flat, and they're not perfectly square. They're actually inclined a little bit because there's no mortar. They're too heavy to use mortar, so they just had to lay them flat on top of one another. They're so perfectly flat, you can't even put a credit card between the stones, even now. At the lower level, this is maybe the coolest engineering feat ever in the history of the world. The whole Temple Mount is just flat amazing.
There was gold leaf in between the bricks.
Okay, so the gold leaf, this is okay, back to when you give your offerings, you didn't have to just throw coins in there. You could also offer other things, right? So a lot of the temple itself was covered with gold, where people would give gold jewelry, they would give gold statues, they would do whatever. And then they plated part of that. So when the disciples are talking about how beautiful this building is, so think about Jesus is, and I'm going way off track here. We may get to the widow, we may not, but I love this stuff. So Jesus is over here where I'm standing. He's east up on the Temple Mount. The sun's coming up behind me in the morning and hitting these buildings and the stones. So the stones are white, brilliant white. The temple is mostly gold plated by this time. And you can just imagine the sun hitting that, and it's like nobody could envision something this cool. It was amazing. And so what happened when the Romans in 70 AD, when they took over, they set fire to everything up here. And then that melted the gold. The gold goes down in between the stones of the temple and other places. And then later they want the gold, so they start pulling the stones apart to get to the gold that had seeped between the stones. So eventually the Romans fairly quickly had completely destroyed the temple, and then also some of the other parts of the platform. And so today, when you're there, you can actually, there's a lot of rocks that came from the temple and the wall that are on the ground below, Because down here, this wall is probably 50 feet high, 40, 50 feet high down here. And they threw them off, so when they hit the pavement, they're too big for anybody to move, so they've been there for 2,000 years. And they're just still laying there. It's crazy. But you can see all around outside here, you can still see the stalls where the money changers were and other salespeople where they sold food, whatever. And now they've recovered the road that goes all the way from here down to the old city of David to the pool of Siloam. So you can see exactly where the pilgrims would have been. When you're walking on those steps, you're walking exactly on the steps that Jesus and his parents walked on, his disciples. All of this is the same thing. It's pretty cool. Now, a lot of the outside wall has been rebuilt, but the platform itself is still there. But it's an amazing feat of engineering. But all those little details to me tie into this story in these ways when you figure out, oh, the money's running this way. This is why people were where they were. So Jesus is probably, when this story starts, he's probably here. He's probably maybe in here, he may be in the women's. Yeah, but he's talking mostly to the priests and the leaders. Right. So I think he spent a part of his time in this area, then coming into here to the women's, to the court of the women. And it says, so I'm going to go to almost, I'm getting ready. I'm going to check my notes and make sure I didn't leave anything out. Not so far. So we're going to go to Mark 12, 41 to 44. And the parallel passage is Luke 21, 1 to 4. But we're going to do Mark 12, 41 to 44. And one of the interesting things about this little passage in Mark is that Mark is more descriptive than Luke, which is very rarely the case. Because if you look in your Bible, for instance, Mark's this thin, and Luke's that, Luke is much larger than Mark. And that's why a lot of people think Mark was written first, is because the shorter things are usually written first, the longer things written next as they add to it. So there's a lot of people believe just for that reason. So it's interesting in here that Mark puts in some details that Luke doesn't, because it's usually the other way around. So it says the lead to this, at least in the parallel Bible, is Matthew 23, 37 to 39, where Jesus is doing the talk over Jerusalem. And so the lead to this is where Jesus says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I've longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So at least in the parallel gospels, their timing is Jesus has given part of this, what's called Olivet Discourse. And then he moves into this because it says, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put. So there's something between there and here. So Jesus has been in around Jerusalem, he's been on the temple area, he's somewhere, and now he comes to sit in the court of the women, opposite the place where the offerings were put, and watch the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Okay, so the offerings are going to go into the temple treasury. That's like here we give our offerings to go into the park treasury, and they get used however the elders want them to be used. They're not specifically used for sacrifices. And Mark's the one that adds the detail. Many rich people threw in large amounts. Now that gets back, and we've talked about this in the past. The offering vessels were shaped somewhat like a cornucopia that we're getting ready to have at Thanksgiving, where they're big on the top and little at the bottom. And you can imagine when you throw in coins, that also works like an old amplifier, where You throw in coins and they bang and they sound loud, and the bigger the coin, the louder the sound. That's how Jesus knew the rich people were throwing in large amounts. You didn't have to see it, you could hear it. And that's what's driving that. But a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a fraction of a penny. You can imagine, some of you probably remember having silver dollars at some point. Throwing silver dollars in, or even bigger than silver dollars. What that would sound like in a metal container versus the little widow's mite if it's gone around. It's just, you wouldn't even hear it, especially in a crowd. And Jesus knew by that, if nothing else, she had done nothing. But he also perceived, as we'll see, it was different. But the whole crowd's there. The crowd knows what's going on. This is no big deal. The rich people are doing this for show, not because they love God, especially. They may have loved God, but it was also a big part of the show. You can imagine, Bill wouldn't do this, I'm sure, but I might. If I had 2 silver dollars, I could place them on there and slide them down and nobody would know. I'm gonna make sure everybody knows I chunked in a bunch of coin. So this is one of the details in Mark 12:43. It says, calling his disciples to him, Jesus said. But in Luke, it doesn't put that detail in. So in Luke, it looks more like he's talking to the crowd or people around him, not just his disciples. But just because he's talking to disciples doesn't mean the crowd can't hear him. But it does appear he's bringing his people close because he's going to give them a very important truth. I tell you the truth. And when he says, I'm telling you the truth, that means like, okay, it's not like I haven't been telling you the truth. It's like when you say, I'm telling you the truth, like, this is really important. This is a big deal. So pay attention. This poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others, not than any of the others, but all the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in everything, all she had to live on. And what a lesson, like Mitch's lesson today. So it's like, God has a different scale than we do. And the scale here for this was Jesus trying to let his apostles know we live on a whole different scale of economy than the rest of the world. It's not nice that, it's so great that the rich people put in lots of money, but that's not how God measures it. What an interesting place that Luke and Mark put it. And Jesus does this at the end of his life. This story is so important that they take out, remember, there's lots of other things they could have put here. They chose this story out of everything they could have put that Jesus did that week because it's that important to us. Isn't that interesting? This isn't just a sweet little story. This is like Jesus saying, this is really important. No, like really important. Pay attention to this. So how does that affect us today? No, let's talk about us. I mean, we all give out of our wealth, and sometimes we give sacrificially, but not often. And realistically, you couldn't give sacrificially like this every week, right? You'd be out. Right? So we do it different ways today. But what are some of the lessons here? I mean, one is the more sacrificial the gift, the more important it is to God, right? We don't get the attaboys for giving out of our excess. But how and what do we give today? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we all have, is how do we time that? How do we do that? What causes do we give to? We've talked about here at church, our elders have changed the causes that we give to just over the past year. And we're doing a lot more in our community than we used to do. we're not doing any less of the other. We've just added some new things to it.
It's none of your business what I'm getting.
Not my business. Sorry.
What, the way it's kind of, it's kind of saying there that they're making a show of what they're giving.
Yeah, Jesus, we're supposed, as we've also been taught, actually, we're taught opposing things about giving. Right, one of the things we're talked about in Matthew is we're to give in secret. Right, don't even let your left hand, much less anybody else, know what your right hand's doing. It's given secret, but only a short passage later, it's very clear that the way you give helps influence other people's lives. And you want to give in a way that God gives the glory. So it's kind of like, you've got to be careful. What this is about is God getting the glory, not us getting the glory. Right? And it's how it's one way we can influence how people come to God. So there's this giving is kind of a tricky deal, but in our world, I think it's even a little trickier than maybe than it was back then. If you lived in this society, the way you would give money would be like they did, temple treasury. You also gave to the poor, the widows, and the orphans. It was a kind of you would give to them directly. It was kind of those were your choices. I probably get 50 requests a month through the mail, through personal, through church, of different things to give money to. And they're all can be great causes, but there's just a wide variety of options, right? And so we have to be very intentional about what we do. And it's a challenge in our world to be really intentional about that. I grew up in a house where my parents wrote a check every week. My mom she made sure every week she wrote a check every week. She gave it in front of the family. So we would know to have that as an example. Doesn't happen anymore, right? Who writes checks? Maybe somebody does, but there's not very many, right? Most of us give online. We pay our bills online. We don't set an example for our children the way that maybe our parents set for us. And it's easier not to be showy, but I think it can be also a little harder to be intentional. It's like, okay, I put that in my automatic debit, or I gave it out of my donor advised fund or whatever. And I don't have as close a tie to it as even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when we wrote checks or put in cash or whatever.
Well, if I gave what I made this month, it wouldn't be very much.
I think that's the point, right? Jesus, you can be the widow mite, if you, and that's his point. It's not how much.
The government.
Yeah.
They,
And that's another point, actually, using that one word. We as a society think about, well, we gave to our taxes and the government's taking care of what church used to do or other things. So we have another excuse on top of people doing.
Yeah, I was thinking when you're talking about when children, grandchildren around, I remember when I grew up, I was pretty poor, to be honest, but my dad, if he had a couple of bucks, just $2, but he always made sure that we had a quarter. He passed, several brothers, whatever down to them, we all have at least. So that we actually felt that quarter was doing something.
Yeah, and we've lost that. So somehow we need to find a way, and I'm not raising money here. That's not what I'm awful at it. It's for us. How do we be more intentional? I was just thinking, Robin and I need to You know, we just got married a little over a year ago. We've never really been as intentional about that as we probably should be. So just stand up here going, okay, this is a little hypocritical. So Robin's now on notice. We'll be having some more talks about how we can be more intentional about how we do it. And we haven't been neglectful. I'm not trying to say that, but you just can't be too intentional about it. Now, what kind of causes does the Bible recommend? This is where I think the Bible can give us guidance that is really powerful in our society. I said, we probably, in mail and personal, we probably get 50 requests, over and over and over. But what kind of things do I know absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt God is good with?
Aren't you proud to be with a group of people that's working with a good budget?
So,
Aren't you glad to be with a group of people that's working with a budget?
yeah,
That's of this group of people?
yeah, our church has a great budget and a big budget. We give away.
It hasn't always been that way with me.
It has, yeah, it has been at the park since I've been here. So
That
very
it's,
digital.
park has, or Park Plaza or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's I don't remember if there's ever been any, please, let's hump up and give some more money because we got troubles.
Yeah, we met the budget. Okay, let's go back to what's okay to give on. Widows, orphans, clearly, poor people, clearly, making disciples, clearly. Those four things, you just gotta say, God's happy with you for that, right? Now, there's other things that come with it because really the lead of that is disadvantaged people, right? It's not so much that you're a widow or an orphan, it's that you're disadvantaged. I think typically disadvantaged beyond your control. You can't help it that you're an orphan. You can't help it that you're a widow. Those sorts of things are beyond your control. So I think in our society, things where people are disadvantaged beyond, and it's out of their control, they fit kind of in that same bucket. Like, and I think of blind people or there's people that helping the adults at Kirk of the Hills, disadvantaged adults because they're mentally born Down syndrome or whatever, So those sorts of things, disadvantaged people beyond their control. It seems to me God has a heart for those people, and we're okay. You're just, I'll just go out on a limb here. I just can't imagine we're gonna get to heaven. Jesus is gonna say, man, I wish you hadn't given money to those people. Why did you ever give money to those orphans? He's not gonna say that, right? So those sorts of things. And so I think I've gotten, and this has been a little rocky road through the years, is I want to give to those things first. And when I run out of those kinds of things, then I'll give to other things. But and so far that hasn't happened. And I don't think it ever will because there's so much of those sorts of things. So I think from this type of giving to me is being intentional to things that I know God's going to approve of. And if I ever run out covering those, then something else. Now, I say that, would I ever give to my college or anything else? So I think about those things of like, there's a certain amount of money, this is a certain amount of money that I'm happy to give to things outside of that, but I don't count that in the same bucket. I think that more as an expense. Do I go to the movies? Do I eat out? Whatever. That's how I think of giving to those other things. That's an expense, not a gift in the same respect. So I've way overstepped my bounds and also time. But and I'm gonna tie it back to Mitch's sermon real quick. And then I'm gonna quit. I mentioned to some of you who were in here earliest, I got blown away by Mitch's sermon this morning early because I'd never read those verses
Amen.
about Jesus asking that Satan has to sift all of the disciples, not just Peter. I've always been taught that he has to sift Peter. When he says he's asked to sift all his disciples, we can take that to mean Satan has asked to sift us. And one of the very easiest places for him to sift us is what we do with our money. That's just like, this is too easy for Satan, right? So it just made sense to me. Once Mitch said that, I hardly heard anything else he said because I just was thinking through that repercussions of thinking about, in a sense, Satan is asking to sift me, sift my loved ones. And Jesus knows we're not going to pass the test all the time. And so to us, it's also that same thing as well. When you come back, when you recover from that, then this is what you do. And so I think it's not, I don't want to leave you guys today thinking, oh, you should feel guilty about what we've done or not done. I think it's more, let's be intentional as we do things so we can lead others and support each other, because that's what Jesus' instructions were to Peter, is to do that, support your brothers. So I think that was a very personal lesson today that fit really well with the widow. It's like, I mean, who would have said a widow with 2 mites could have any influence? And yet you think, who has had in the whole Bible, who's had more influence over people's actions in the world than that widow with 2 mites? Jesus can use us in this sense.
The best part about that is she didn't do it for recognition. She did it left side, right side, don't know what they're doing. I mean, she wasn't looking for anything. He wants us all to lean into him. What's it going to take for us to give away so that we are leaning into him?
Well said, and we're going to end with that. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
You feel
Probably better do that.